Two volunteers stood by the drink station with their arms crossed, watching the same thing everyone else in the mess tent was pretending not to watch. "She's doing it again," the first one said, low, tilting his cup toward the far side of the tent. "Every evening, without fail, the old farmer fills a canteen he never drinks from and carries it to the fence line alone. And every evening, she puts him out there before he can even sit down." The second volunteer didn't answer right away. He was watching Sloane Kingsley cross the tent with her run sheet in hand, watching the way the room rearranged itself around her the moment she moved, the way water finds a lower place to be. 40 residents ate dinner at Fort Mill Race's Veteran Transition Initiative that night, same as every night that month, at 11 tables built to seat 44. There was always room. There was never room for him. Kingsley reached Emmett Gant's elbow before he'd cleared the tray line and turned him, with 2 fingers and a practice sentence, toward a folding chair set up against the perimeter fence, 40 feet from the nearest table and lit by a single sodium lamp that buzzed like it resented the job. "Per the rotation, Mr. Gant," she said, not unkindly, the way a woman recites a number she has said so many times it no longer feels like a sentence to her. "We keep new intake and drop-ins along the fence line this week. Frees up the main tables for continuity residents." He had been coming to that mess tent for 11 weeks. He said nothing. He carried his tray to the folding chair and sat, and the seat beside him stayed empty, as it had stayed empty for 11 weeks running. One chair, unoccupied at every meal, in a camp built to hold 4 men and short exactly one willing to sit next to him. 6 days. That was the number nobody in that tent was thinking about yet except Kingsley, who thought about it constantly, and it sat on her clipboard like a fuse. 6 days until the Regional Authority's Emergency Requisition Board finalized a new contract for the purification trailer that had been coughing and sputtering behind the utility shed for 3 weeks. The same trailer that fed drinking water to every one of those 40 residents. The same 6 days that lined up not by coincidence but by scheduling, with the camp's federal accreditation renewal. Somewhere in that 6-day window sat a decision that would replace a piece of aging Army equipment nobody in the room understood, at a cost nobody in the room had questioned, on a timeline nobody in the room controlled. If you've ever watched someone mistake quiet for nothing at all, you already know how this story ends up proving them wrong. The 2 volunteers went back to stacking trays. Somewhere behind the mess tent, the purification trailer hummed on, off, on, in a rhythm it hadn't held since spring, feeding a pressure gauge that ticked 1 degree past where it should have sat, and that not one certified pair of eyes in that camp had yet thought to ask why. Gant uncapped his canteen at the folding chair, filled it at the spigot behind him without looking, and set it beside his boot the way another man might set down a hat. He ate slowly. He did not look at the empty chair. Somewhere past the fence, the light was going the soft copper color that comes before dark, and he watched it the way he watched most things now, without hurry, as though he had already decided how the evening would end and was only waiting for the rest of the camp to catch up to him. The canvas coat was the first thing anyone noticed, and the last thing anyone understood. Its collar had gone the color of a dry creek bed, pale where his neck had worn it thin, and beneath it he kept a flannel shirt buttoned to the throat even on the warm evenings, as if cold were a debt he intended to pay ahead of schedule. He moved through the camp in a particular economy, turning his whole body rather than reaching across it, because the right shoulder would not lift past the height of his own chest anymore, and hadn't for years, an old injury he never named, and nobody had the standing to ask about twice. He did not limp. He did not shake. He simply arranged the world so that shoulder never had to answer for anything, and in that arrangement there was a kind of order that a careful person might have recognized as discipline rather than decline. Each evening, after the tray was cleared and the fence-line chair had done its work of separating him from the tables, Emmett Gant walked to the spigot behind the mess tent and performed a ritual so plain that nobody thought to call it one. He filled the canteen. He tapped the base twice against his palm, listening for the sound of the air pocket clearing, and only then did he thread the cap down, turning it with 2 fingers until it seated with a small, definite click. He carried it, always in his left hand, past the generator shed, past the stacked pallets of bottled water nobody used because the trailer was supposed to make bottled water unnecessary, to the fence line at the camp's western edge. There he stood for a while, long enough that the light usually finished its change from copper to ash while he waited. And then he unscrewed the cap and poured the water out into the dry grass, slow, so it wouldn't splash back onto his boots, and capped the empty canteen again before he walked back. Nobody asked him why. It was the kind of question that required a relationship to ask, and the camp had not given him one. Tanner Ogle broke that unwritten rule without ever calling it broken. He was 24, built like a man who'd spent his youth loading trucks rather than lifting weights for the appearance of it, and he ran camp logistics with the loose, easy competence of someone who had not yet learned to be impressed with his own decisions. He'd started bringing Gant coffee on his second week volunteering, not out of pity. He would have said, if anyone asked, that pity was for people who needed something done for them, and Gant had never once looked like a man who needed anything done for him, but because the fence line chair was on Tanner's walk back from the equipment shed anyway, and it seemed wasteful not to share the thermos. "You take it black," Tanner said the first time, setting the cup down without asking. "Figured a man who irons his own collar don't want cream in his coffee." Gant had looked at him for a moment too long to be comfortable, and then nodded once, and that was the whole of their friendship's founding document. It was on one of those evenings, waiting while Gant knelt to check a strap on his canvas tool roll before the walk to the fence, that Tanner first saw the brass key. It sat nested in a fold of oiled cloth among a scatter of hand tools that looked older than Tanner's own father. A small forged thing, no longer than a finger, stamped along one flat face with a series of fine notches that didn't match any tool Tanner had ever handled at the camp's own maintenance bench. "What's that one do?" he'd asked, more out of habit than real curiosity, the way a person asks about a stranger's dog. Gant closed the roll before answering, cinching the strap with his left hand while his right stayed low and still at his side. "Tells the truth about water," he said, "when nothing else in the shed will." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, and Tanner laughed a little because it sounded like something an old man says to sound wise to a young one, and neither of them yet knew how literally it was meant. Sloane Kingsley was, in fact, very good at her job, and the camp's supply crisis 3 days later proved it in a way no run sheet ever could. A truck bound for Fort Mill Race, with 2 weeks of dry goods, blew a transmission 40 miles out, and by 6 that evening, the kitchen staff stood in front of half-empty shelves doing math that didn't work. 40 residents, 3 meals a day, and enough rice and canned protein, by careful count, for 1.5 days if nobody so much as sneezed near the pantry. Kingsley didn't panic. She stood in the middle of the kitchen with her printed run sheet flattened against the steel counter and rebuilt the week from nothing. Cut the Thursday cookout to a soup rotation, borrowed dry stores from the adjoining fire district on a same-week repayment. She negotiated over the phone in 4 minutes flat and reassigned 2 kitchen volunteers to a supply run before the sun was fully down. It was, by any measure a fair person would apply, the work of someone who understood exactly how a camp like this survived a bad week. And for one evening, the residents ate a smaller meal and never once went hungry, because Sloane Kingsley had made 40 people's dinner work with the arithmetic of 11. It was in the calm after that crisis, with her clipboard finally quiet and her shoulders down from where they'd been riding all evening, that Gant approached her near the equipment shed. He didn't ask for anything. He nodded once toward the low structure behind the mess tent, where the purification trailer sat clicking through its uneven cycle, on, off, on, a half-second longer between each cycle than it had run the week before. "That gauge is telling you something," he said. "Might be worth 5 minutes before the vendor's next visit." It was the first full sentence he'd offered her in 11 weeks, and it cost him something to offer it. She could see that if she'd been looking, in the way he held his right shoulder even stiller than usual, bracing for a door he expected to close. It closed. "Per the rotation," Kingsley said, already turning back toward her clipboard, the run sheet's authority settling over her like a coat she put on without thinking. "Any maintenance request on camp infrastructure routes through the certified vendor contract, not through volunteer input. I appreciate you flagging it, Mr. Gant, but that trailer's under warranty terms I can't have a guest tampering with." She said guess the way you'd say visitor to someone who had, in fact, slept in the same camp bunk for 11 weeks running, and the word landed exactly as flat as she meant it to. Gant didn't argue. He looked at the trailer once more, the way another man might glance at a friend across a room before leaving a party, and walked back toward the fence line, canteen already in hand, the evening's ritual waiting for him same as always. The gatekeeping did not announce itself as gatekeeping. It arrived instead in small procedural doses, each one wearing the clean face of policy. 2 days after Kingsley's refusal, Gant found the utility shed door locked against him for the first time in 11 weeks. A hasp and a combination lock installed sometime that morning with a laminated notice zip-tied beside it. Authorized vendor personnel only. He stood in front of it a moment, read the notice twice the way a man reads a headstone, and turned away without touching the lock. The next evening, a camp security volunteer half his age stopped him 30 feet from the trailer pad and asked him, politely enough, what business he had loitering near restricted equipment. Gant answered him with 4 words, listening to the pump. And the volunteer, unsure what to do with an answer that honest, let him pass with a warning that wouldn't have held up if either of them had thought to write it down. And on the 3rd day, a different security volunteer, newer and more nervous, reached for the strap of Gant's canvas tool roll outside the mess tent and asked to inspect its contents for camp safety compliance, a request that had never once been made of any other resident in 11 weeks of meals. Gant set the roll down himself before the young man's hand closed on it, unbuckled it with his left hand, and let him look. There was nothing in it the camp's own safety list would have flagged. A scatter of hand tools, a coil of test tubing, the small brass key folded in its cloth, and the volunteer, embarrassed at finding nothing, handed it back with an apology he didn't quite know how to phrase. Gant only said, "The gauge behind the shed is running long on its clicks. Somebody ought to look at that before it looks at you," and buckled the roll closed again, unhurried, as if the whole exchange had cost him nothing at all. Tanner watched all 3 incidents from different distances, the locked shed, the security stop, the tool roll, and each one sat a little heavier than the last, the way 3 small stones make a different weight stacked than scattered. It wasn't that any single one of them looked like cruelty. It was that they added up to something that didn't square with a man who'd done nothing but eat quietly at a fence line and warn people, unasked, about a machine that was breaking down in exactly the rhythm he kept describing. Tanner found himself standing near the trailer pad that evening, longer than his job required, listening for the click Gant kept mentioning, and hearing it, finally, for what it was. Not a rattle, not routine wear, but a gap where a sound should have been and wasn't. The vendor's certified inspector arrived on the 4th day for the trailer's scheduled quarterly test. A clean-cut man with a tablet mount bolted to a rolling case of sensors, and Kingsley stood beside him with her run sheet ready to log the result before it had even printed. Residents gathered at a respectful distance, drawn by the novelty of watching anything happen to the trailer at all, and Gant stood among them, permitted, for the first time in days, to be near the pad. As an observer only, Kingsley had specified, arms folded per the rotation. The inspector ran his diagnostic in 11 neat steps, each one a chirp from his handheld unit, and on the 11th, the trailer's readout returned a flat, undramatic failure. Output within acceptable mineral range, sensor array reporting no anomaly, and yet the water pooling in the sample basin sat cloudier than it should have. A haze the machine's own instruments insisted wasn't there. "Passes on every line we test," the inspector said, tapping the readout for Kingsley's benefit. "If residents are reporting taste complaints, that's likely just seasonal mineral content. Recommend the replacement unit per the existing bid. This one's aging out regardless." Kingsley nodded, already reaching to initial the form, the 6-day clock ticking 1 day closer to done. Gant asked quietly if he might taste it. Kingsley hesitated. It wasn't per anything, wasn't in any procedure she'd written. But the inspector, amused more than concerned, shrugged and handed him a sample cup, the kind of permission a confident man grants because he's certain it will cost him nothing. Gant drank a small measure, held it a moment, and set the cup down without comment on the taste at all. Instead, he crouched at the trailer's intake line, laid 2 fingers flat against the housing, and listened to the draw the way another man might listen to a heartbeat through a stethoscope. Though nothing about the gesture was medical or theatrical, it was simply patient, exact, unhurried in a way that made the whole gathered crowd go quiet without anyone asking them to. "Valve seats worn on the inlet side," he said. "Not enough to trip your sensor." Enough to let fine sediment through on the drawdown every third or fourth cycle when the pressure drops below where your equipment's threshold is set to look. The inspector's amusement thinned. Our sensor calibration is factory certified to 0.01 tolerance, he said. If there were a seat failure of that scale, we'd register it. Gant reached into his tool roll, unbuckled it with his left hand, and set the small brass key on the trailer's housing between them. This one's ground to a tolerance your factory never built for, he said, because I filed it by hand for a seat that doesn't exist anymore in any parts catalog you've got. Fit it to the test port and you'll see the gap your sensor can't. He said it without triumph, the way a man states a measurement, and in the silence that followed, 40 residents and 1 certified inspector and 1 program director with a pen still hovering over a form all watched an old farmer in a canvas coat fit a hand-filed key into a test port. None of them had known was there, and turn it and watch water bead along a seam that a moment before had registered on every modern instrument in that yard as perfectly sound. The emergency requisition meeting, originally scheduled for the following week alongside the accreditation review, was moved up by 2 days the moment the inspector's supplemental report reached the regional authority, not because anyone believed an old farmer over a certified sensor, but because a documented seat failure, however small, was exactly the kind of liability language that made administrators move fast. Kingsley found herself that same evening standing in the camp's records room long after the mess tent had cleared, her run sheet abandoned on the counter for once, pulling folder after folder from a filing cabinet that hadn't been opened in longer than her 3 years at the camp. She was looking, she told herself, only for the original specification sheet, something to cite in her own report before the board convened, something that would let her write a sentence more precise than an old man said so. What she found instead was an absence shaped exactly like a name. The trailer's design specification, filed under the regional authority's own letterhead, credited a contracting firm she recognized immediately because it shared a surname with the man who had signed her hiring letter 3 years earlier. Her own father's engineering firm, listed as the system's originating designer, with a filing date 5 years back. There was no earlier document, there was no field manual. There was no Emmett Gant anywhere in a paper trail that, by every rule of institutional memory, ought to have led straight back to him. She sat with that for longer than she meant to, the fluorescent light overhead humming in the same uneven rhythm the trailer had kept for weeks, and did not yet know what to do with the shape of what she'd found, only that it did not sit right, the way a chair with one short leg does not sit right, no matter how the room is arranged around it. Tanner, meanwhile, had gone looking in the wrong direction with the right instinct, which was its own kind of trouble. He'd heard from a kitchen volunteer that the base's older paper archive, cardboard boxes from the camp's original Army Depot years, stored in a converted supply shed nobody used anymore, was scheduled for a records purge that same week, cleared to make room for a coming renovation tied to the accreditation review. He spent 2 evenings hauling boxes under a bare bulb, looking for anything with Gant's name on it. And on the second evening, he found a water-stained binder near the bottom of a crate marked for disposal, its cover long since faded past legibility, its spine cracked from decades of handling. He'd have missed it. It was sitting 3 boxes deep in a stack already tagged for the following morning's pickup. If he hadn't stopped, on a hunch he couldn't have explained to anyone credentialed, to check one more crate before calling it a night. He carried it out from under the purge tag with 20 minutes to spare before the disposal crew's morning run, not yet knowing what he was holding, only that it felt, in his hands, like something that had been waiting a long time to be carried out of a room instead of left in it. General Porter Havermeyer arrived for the accreditation review on the 5th day. 3 vehicles and a small aid detail rolling through the camp gate at an hour when most of the residents were still finishing breakfast, and the mess tent went through its familiar bracing. Chairs straightened, run sheets checked, Kingsley smoothing her own uniform collar out of a habit she hadn't examined in years. He was 66, silver at the temples in the particular way of men who'd earned it outdoors rather than in an office. 4 stars settled on his shoulders with the unbothered weight of a man who had stopped needing them to prove anything decades ago. He moved through the introductions Kingsley had rehearsed, the program overview, the accreditation binder, the polite procession toward the mess tent for the traditional breakfast with residents, and then, Without any signal that the room could read in advance, he stopped. He was looking past Kingsley's shoulder toward the fence line, where Emmett Gant sat finishing a cup of coffee Tanner had brought him 20 minutes before. Havermeyer crossed the tent in a straight line that cut through the middle of the breakfast crowd, past the folding chairs, past Kingsley's half-finished sentence about the morning's schedule, and stopped in front of the old farmer in the canvas coat. He did not speak. He reached up, removed his own service cap, and set it down on the table in front of Gant, gently, the way a man sets down something he has carried a long way and is finally permitted to put down. Then he stood there, hands empty, and waited. The mess tent had gone silent in the particular way. A room goes silent when it senses a hierarchy it did not know existed being quietly rearranged in front of it. Kingsley's rehearsed sentence died somewhere in her throat. Gant looked at the cap for a long moment before he looked up at the man who'd set it there, and something passed between the two of them that the room could see the shape of without being able to read the words. "Captain," Gant said finally, and it was the only word either of them needed for a moment that had been 47 years arriving. "It's general now," Havermeyer said, "but you were the one who taught me the difference between a rank and an obligation, Sergeant, and I never did get to finish paying that particular debt." He turned then to the room at large, to Kingsley specifically, and his voice took on the register of a man delivering something he'd rehearsed in the truck on the drive over. 47 years ago, this man built a purification rig out of scavenged parts on the bank of a river I won't name for you, under conditions I won't describe for a breakfast crowd, and it kept 11 men from dying of the water we had no choice but to drink. I was a young captain who owed him my life and didn't know how to say so properly, so I wrote a commendation instead, with my own signature on it, crediting Sergeant First Class Emmett Gant for the design that likely saved this camp's own trailer system 3 generations later. He paused. I have spent 5 years wondering why that commendation was never in this camp's founding archive when I finally went looking for it. I believe I now know the answer, and I do not believe I'm going to like it. Kingsley, standing very still with her run sheet forgotten at her side, felt the floor of her own certainty shift under a name she recognized before the general said it aloud, a regional contracts administrator whose signature appeared, she now remembered, with a cold and specific dread, on the same filing that credited her father's firm with a design that had, in fact, never once been theirs. Emmett Gant did not raise his voice, and he did not stand, because standing quickly had not been available to him for some years, and he had long since stopped pretending otherwise. He sat with the general's cap still resting on the table before him, untouched, and told it plain, the way he told most things. "I didn't hide the manual," he said. "I handed it to a superior for safekeeping, same as I'd have handed him a canteen or a rifle, because that's what the rank was for back then." Man's name was Wendell Northcott. Young logistics officer, sharp as anything, always had a form ready before you knew you needed one. I trusted him with it the way you trust a man whose paperwork looks clean. Never thought to ask for it back. Man like me doesn't ask twice for credit. Asking once already felt like more than the work required. He turned his cup slowly on the table, not drinking from it, just turning it. Same reason I never argued the rotation here. Didn't seem worth the noise sitting by a fence instead of a table. A seat's a seat. Water's the thing that matters, and I could still see the trailer from where they put me. Kingsley had already begun to understand, in the cold arithmetic she was better at than anyone in that camp, exactly what her own 3 years of run sheets had been built on top of. She left the tent before the general finished his coffee, made 2 phone calls from the records room with a voice she did not entirely recognize as her own, and by that afternoon had pulled the regional authority's contracts office into a conversation nobody there wanted to have, because Wendell Northcott's 5-year-old filing, the one crediting her father's firm with a design Gant had built 47 years before either of them was born, was now sitting next to a commendation with a 4-star general's signature on it, and there was no version of that comparison her father's firm survived without her turning the paperwork over herself, first, and in writing. She found Gant again at dusk, at the fence line, where he stood as he always did, canteen in his left hand, the water inside it, catching the day's last copper light. "The board's voting to reverse the contract before the deadline," she said. "I filed the correction myself. My father's firm won't be getting that trailer contract, and I've asked for a formal review of Wendell Northcott's filing history going back as far as it goes." She stopped, then added, quieter, the thing that had actually brought her out to the fence. "I put you at this fence for 11 weeks because a rotation chart told me to, and I never once asked what it cost you to sit there. I'm not going to pretend a corrected form makes that even." Gant looked at her a moment, then unscrewed the canteen's cap, the way he did every evening, and did not pour it out yet. "She used to fill this exact model canteen for me before every deployment," he said, and it was the first time in 11 weeks he had said the name at all. Eleanor capped it herself, tapped the air out first so it wouldn't slosh and give a position away. "Told me once it didn't matter if I drank from it or not. What mattered was one of us always had it ready to go, in case the day came we needed to move fast and didn't have time to think." He looked out at the darkening field beyond the fence. "She's been gone 11 years now. I still fill it, still cap it the way she taught me. Pour it out most nights because there's nowhere left that needs me to move fast anymore." He capped the canteen the way she'd taught him to, not for thirst, but so one of them was always ready to go. Didn't figure anybody needed to know that. Didn't seem like camp business. Kingsley didn't answer right away, and for once she let the quiet sit instead of filling it with a sentence from her run sheet. The plaque went up on the utility shed 6 weeks later, small and unceremonious, the kind of correction that institutions make quietly once they've decided to stop being loud about their mistakes. Purification System Design, originating Engineer Sergeant First Class Emmett Gant, with the commendation date beneath it in numerals precise enough that nobody in that regional authority's office would ever again have room to misplace them. Wendell Northcott's filing history was by then under a review that had already cost him his position and would in time cost him considerably more, though Gant never asked after the particulars and Kingsley never volunteered them at the fence. She had changed exactly one policy in the weeks between, and she'd done it herself, in writing, without waiting for the board to ask her to. The rotation seating chart was gone. There were no assigned tables at Fort Millrace's mess tent anymore, no folding chair set apart by the fence with a number attached to it, no metric deciding who sat where on a given night. Residents sat where they liked, which meant, more often than not, that the tables filled unevenly and imperfectly, and exactly the way a room fills when nobody's telling it how, and nobody at that camp seemed to miss the old system even once it was gone. Tanner still brought Gant his coffee black, though there was less need for it now. Gant ate at the long tables most evenings, same as anyone, and the seat beside him had stopped being a question anyone had to answer. But some evenings, the two of them still walked out past the generator shed together, toward the fence line, because some rituals outlast the reason they were forced into being and become, instead, something a person keeps on purpose. That evening, at dusk, with the light going the same soft copper it had held on the first night this story found him, Emmett Gant filled his canteen at the spigot, tapped it twice against his palm, and capped it. Beside him, Tanner filled a second one, mirroring the motion without needing to be told how, tapping his own, twice out of a habit that had become, in 6 short weeks, something closer to inheritance than imitation. They walked together to the fence line, 2 canteens instead of 1, and stood there while the field beyond went from copper to ash, and this time neither man poured his water out. Inside the newly labeled shed behind them, the small brass valve key hung from a nail beside the trailer's access panel, in plain sight now, waiting for no one in particular to notice it, and needing no one's permission to stay there. Some rooms only learn who built them long after the builder stopped asking to be believed.